Snow was falling the night everything in Emily Carter's life collapsed. What was meant to be a quiet December evening turned into a storm of loss she never expected. Her husband, Michael, had been driving home from a late shift when black ice sent his car into a ditch at the edge of town. The phone rang once, and in that single moment, her world split open. Neighbors whispered that grief had a way of swallowing people whole, and by morning, many assumed Emily would disappear into the cold weight of despair. Christmas lights glowed through windows across the street, but in her home, every bulb felt like a cruel reminder of what she no longer had. Yet something strange happened as she stood alone in her living room, clutching Michael's worn winter coat. The lights flickered, not out, but brighter, as if touched by a quiet hand unseen. Emily froze. The room felt warmer, almost gently filled with a presence she couldn't explain. She didn't know that heaven had already begun writing a chapter she could never have imagined, one stitched with purpose, protection, and a miracle timed to the very second of her breaking. And on that night, before the town even heard the news, before the grief settled fully in her chest, Emily whispered into the stillness, "Help me, God, please." It was the first prayer she had spoken in years, and it did not go unheard. Emily Carter had always lived quietly on the edge of Willow Creek, a small town that wore its seasons like stories stitched across its rooftops. Winter, especially, had a way of settling over the hills like a soft hymn, gentle, familiar, and patient. Emily and Michael had built their life there one modest step at a time. They had a small white house with green shutters, a porch swing Michael repaired every spring, and a tiny garden where Emily planted lilies, because Michael said they looked like little lanterns God forgot to turn off. Their marriage was not perfect, but it was honest. He worked long hours at the lumber mill, and she spent her days as a receptionist at the local clinic. Every December, though, their schedules aligned just enough for them to share traditions that felt like anchors, hanging the same old ornaments, baking cinnamon bread for neighbors, visiting the church where Michael's father used to lead the choir. Christmas had always been their season of quiet gratitude. Now the house felt hollow, each corner carrying echoes of things that suddenly belonged to yesterday. The porch swing moved slightly in the winter wind, as if waiting for a weight that would never return. Emily avoided looking at it, the memories pressed too close. Inside, their tree stood half-decorated. They were supposed to finish it together the next evening. Michael had insisted on finding one last hand-carved ornament at the winter market. He never came home with it. Friends visited that first morning with casseroles, soft voices, and well-meant attempts at comfort, but Emily barely registered their presence. She nodded when expected, thanked them automatically, and watched the door close behind each of them. Silence felt safer. Emily's younger brother, Thomas, arrived just after noon. He lived 2 towns away but drove the snowy roads the moment he heard. He whispered, not asking permission before pulling her into a firm embrace. She didn't cry. She simply folded into him like someone too tired to stand on her own. "Let me stay a few days," he said quietly. "You don't have to," she murmured. "I do." He cooked for her that evening, barely touched the food himself, but made sure she ate a few bites. He tidied the living room, covered the half-finished tree with a sheet so she wouldn't have to look at it, and settled on the couch to keep her company. But despite his presence, Emily felt something else lingering in the air. She didn't know how to name it, only that every so often a warmth brushed against her, fleeting and real, like a hand passed near a candle flame. At first she dismissed it as exhaustion, then as imagination fueled by grief. Still, it returned again and again. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emily wandered to Michael's workshop, a small shed behind the house filled with sawdust, tools, and half-finished projects he always promised to complete one day. She pushed the door open. The cold was sharp, but the moment she stepped inside, the air felt unexpectedly still, almost reverent. On the workbench lay a wooden ornament, unfinished but unmistakably shaped into a tiny lantern. Her breath caught. He must have been carving it for the tree. She ran her fingers along its edges. In that quiet room, surrounded by the scent of pine and cedar, the weight of her loss pressed harder. But something else rested beneath it, a whisper of meaning she could not yet understand. A single sentence escaped her lips, barely audible. "Lord, don't let this be the end of my story." Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and steady, as if covering the earth with a promise she had not yet learned to believe in. The days that followed unfolded with a heaviness Emily could barely navigate. Willow Creek was a kind town, but like any small place, news traveled quickly, often shaped by whispers rather than truth. By the time Emily returned to the clinic to sign a few necessary forms, she could feel eyes on her, soft, pitying, and quietly accusing. Some wondered why she had let Michael drive so late on icy roads. Others murmured that she should have convinced him to stay home that night. A few day with no malice but careless tongues suggested she had been growing distant from church in recent years, and that such sorrow tended to find those who drifted too far from faith. Emily heard fragments of these comments as she walked through the grocery store, as she waited at the post office, even as she stepped into church on Sunday morning. No one said them to her directly, but the glances, the hushed pauses, they were enough. Thomas noticed it before she did. "They don't know a thing," he muttered under his breath as they left the bakery one afternoon. Two women had stepped aside as Emily passed, whispering behind gloved hands. "It doesn't matter," Emily replied quietly. "It should," he insisted, but Emily shook her head. She didn't have the strength to defend herself against shadows. Her real grief, the one no one could see, was heavier than any rumor. Nights became the hardest part. She would lie awake listening to the house settle, the wind brushing against the windows, the distant bells of the church tower marking each passing hour. The bed felt too large without Michael's steady warmth. She often reached for him instinctively, only to wake fully and realize the emptiness at her side. On the fourth night, unable to bear it, she fled downstairs and curled up on the couch beneath a quilt her mother had sewn years ago. She clutched Michael's unfinished wooden lantern, holding it so tightly her knuckles ached. The grief surged again, raw, sharp, almost suffocating. "Why now?" she whispered into the darkness. "Why this way?" It was the closest she had come to breaking. The next morning, the weight of public scrutiny grew sharper. At the funeral visitation, an older man from town, a well-meaning church elder, approached her with a somber expression. "Emily," he said gently, "sometimes the Lord allows storms to turn us back toward him. Perhaps this is a season of correction." Thomas stepped forward immediately, but Emily placed a hand on his arm. She managed a polite nod, though her heart caved inward. Correction, the word echoed painfully. Hours later, after the service, she stood alone by Michael's grave as the final snowfall settled over the fresh mound of earth. The cemetery was quiet. The world paused in white stillness. She spoke only once, her voice trembling. "I don't understand what you're doing." It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was a wounded prayer from someone who still believed God existed. She just no longer knew where he was in the breaking. Behind her, the town slowly dispersed, carrying their casseroles, their commentary, and their half-formed judgments. Emily remained until the cold forced her to leave. When she finally turned back toward her car, she felt a deep ache in her chest, the kind that doesn't come from loss alone, but from the fear that loss might be all that remains. Yet even then, even in that hollow walk across the frozen ground, heaven was already preparing a thread of purpose that would soon pull her out of the shadows. She simply did not see it yet. The week after the funeral moved slowly, as though time itself had thickened around Emily. The world outside continued its rhythm. Children waiting for school buses, neighbors clearing snow from their driveways, church bells ringing at dawn. But inside her heart, nothing moved at all. Grief had settled like a winter fog, dense and consuming. One evening, when Thomas stepped out to pick up groceries, Emily found herself sitting alone at the kitchen table, the wooden lantern resting beside a cup of untouched tea. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses a person to listen to thoughts they would rather avoid. She traced the small carved lines with her fingertips, feeling each ridge and corner. It was unfinished, imperfect yet strangely comforting. She whispered into the stillness, "Lord, what am I supposed to learn from this?" There was no voice, no sudden sign, no warmth filling the room as it had on that first night. Only silence. But in that silence, she began to notice something she had overlooked for days. The ache in her chest was not pulling her away from God, it was pulling her toward Him. Grief had stripped away distractions, leaving only the raw, honest truth of her dependence on something greater than herself. She opened Michael's old Bible, the one he kept on the bookshelf by the window. A folded piece of paper slipped out, a note he had written months earlier, perhaps after one of their ordinary evenings together. His handwriting, familiar and steady, filled the page. "When you can't understand God's hands, trust His heart." Emily closed her eyes. She remembered the night he had spoken those words to her at the church's Christmas service the year before. They had stood near the nativity display, the lights glowing softly on the snow. "Life won't always make sense," he had said, "but God's goodness doesn't disappear when our understanding does." She hadn't thought of that moment since the accident. Now it returned with unexpected clarity, like a lantern being lit one small flame at a time. For the first time since losing him, she bowed her head and prayed, not out of despair, not out of fear, but out of surrender. "God, if there is still something you're doing here, help me see it. Don't let this pain be empty." The prayer didn't erase the sorrow, but it steadied her breathing. It softened something hardened in her chest. And as she sat there, the quiet no longer felt hollow. It felt inhabited, as though a gentle presence had settled near her, not demanding answers, not offering explanations, but simply sitting with her in the ache. That night, she placed Michael's Bible on the table, opened it to the Psalms, and read until her eyes grew heavy. Words she had read long ago carried new weight. The Lord is near to the broken-hearted. Near, not distant, not indifferent. She whispered a final thought before sleep. "If you're near, I'll try to be still enough to notice." Heaven heard her, and the first thread of healing had quietly begun. As Emily closed the Bible and rested her hand over the unfinished lantern, a quiet resolve settled in her chest. She didn't have clarity, not yet, but she felt the faintest shift inside her, the beginning of trust returning after a long silence. Grief was still present, heavy and real, yet something deeper was stirring beneath it, like the first glow of dawn behind a frozen horizon. And for anyone watching her story, standing where she now stood, in confusion, in loss, in unanswered questions, her next breath carried a gentle reminder, even in seasons that feel unbearable, God is not finished writing. If this story is touching your heart or mirroring a chapter of your own, stay with Emily a little longer. Her journey is far from over, and the miracle heaven prepared for her is closer than she can imagine. Sometimes the turning point comes quietly. Sometimes it comes right after the prayer we whisper with trembling hands. 3 days after that quiet prayer at her kitchen table, Emily woke earlier than usual. The sky outside was still dim, layered in soft winter blue. She slipped on her coat, stepped onto the porch, and let the cold morning air meet her face. Something pulled her toward Michael's workshop. She couldn't explain why. It felt almost like a gentle nudge in her spirit. When she opened the door, light from the rising sun filtered through the small window, landing directly on the unfinished wooden lantern. She picked it up carefully, noticing a faint pencil outline she hadn't seen before, a tiny star etched on the top, drawn with care. Michael always added personal touches to his carvings, but she hadn't realized he planned one for this piece. Her fingers trembled as she traced it. A soft knock startled her. She turned to find Pastor Raymond standing outside, bundled in a long coat. "Forgive the early visit," he said gently. "I felt prompted to stop by." Emily hesitated, then nodded for him to enter. He looked around the shed, taking in Michael's tools and half-finished projects. "He had a gift for bringing beauty out of simple things," the pastor murmured. Emily swallowed hard. "I didn't know you were nearby." "I wasn't," he admitted. "I was on my morning walk when your house came to mind. Strongly. I've learned to pay attention to moments like that." He paused, then added quietly, "I know people have spoken carelessly. I'm sorry for that. Grief should never be met with judgment." The sincerity in his voice broke something open inside her. She didn't cry, but her shoulders softened, as though a small weight had lifted. Pastor Raymond reached into his coat and handed her a folded note. "This was placed in the offering box last Sunday. No name, no explanation, just your name on the outside." Emily unfolded it slowly. Inside was a single sentence, written in neat handwriting. "You are not walking this valley alone." No signature, no clue, yet the words struck her deeply. Not because they were poetic, but because they echoed the prayer she had whispered days earlier. She looked up. "Do you know who wrote it?" He shook his head. "But I believe God sends reminders at the exact moment we need them." It would have been easy to dismiss the note as coincidence, but something within her, something tender and awakening, recognized the timing as too precise, too gentle to ignore. Later that afternoon, she returned to the house to find a voicemail from the clinic director. "Emily, we've been reviewing Michael's benefits package again. There was an overlooked clause, one that increases the support you're eligible for. It should help you stay on your feet these next months." She listened to the message twice, stunned. The amount wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to relieve the financial pressure that had been quietly building since the accident. 2 unexpected moments in one day. 2 small lanterns lighting the path forward. That evening, snow began to drift softly again. Emily stood by the window, holding the wooden lantern. For the first time since losing Michael, she breathed without feeling like her chest would shatter. "God, if these are from you," she whispered, "thank you." No bright sign followed, no sudden warmth, just peace. Gentle, steady, unmistakable. It was the first blessing. The first turn in a story heaven had been writing long before the winter storm. Just as Emily began to steady herself, life shifted again, quietly at first, then with a force that made her question everything she had regained. 2 weeks after the unexpected blessings, Willow Creek was swallowed by a brutal cold front. Temperatures dropped to dangerous lows, pipes froze across town, and the clinic where Emily worked became overwhelmed with patients suffering from winter-related illnesses. When she arrived one icy morning, the director pulled her aside. "Emily, I'm so sorry," he said. "Because of the storm damage and budget cuts, we have to temporarily reduce staff hours, possibly for the next month." Her stomach tightened. "How many hours?" He hesitated. Half of her income gone, just as she had begun to breathe again. "I understand," she said softly, though her voice wavered. It wasn't anyone's fault. The entire town was struggling, yet the news hit her like a fresh blow, reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. Driving home that evening, snow falling in heavy sheets across her windshield, her old car sputtered as if resisting the cold. A warning light blinked on. She pressed her lips together, praying it would make it up the hill to her street. It did, barely. When she parked in the driveway, the engine gave one last groan before shutting off completely. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, forehead resting on the steering wheel. Lord, not another thing. Please. Inside the house, the temperature felt lower than usual. She checked the thermostat. Nothing. The furnace had shut down at some point during the day. Thomas, who had returned to his own job earlier that week, wasn't there to help her troubleshoot. By midnight, the house was cold enough that she wrapped herself in layers and lit every safe candle she could find. The shadows flickered across the walls, casting long shapes that made the empty rooms feel even larger. Her breath trembled. "Why does it keep getting harder?" she whispered into the half-lit dark. She wasn't angry at God, but she was weary in a way that reached bone deep. The earlier blessings now felt distant, almost fragile against the weight of these new challenges. She feared slipping back into the grief she had just begun to rise out of. The next morning, she called a repair service for the furnace. The earliest appointment they could manage was 4 days away. Storm delays, frozen roads, overwhelmed technicians. She thanked them and hung up, her shoulders sinking. 4 days, 4 nights in a freezing house. She considered staying with a friend, but the thought of leaving the space where she still felt Michael's presence carved small panic circles in her chest. She wanted her home, even if it was cold, even if it hurt. That evening, wrapped in 2 blankets and sitting beside a cluster of candles, the cold pressed in harder. Her hands shook slightly. The wooden lantern sat beside her on the table, catching the warm glow of the flames. The little carved star at the top reflected tiny points of light. She closed her eyes. "Lord, I'm trying, but I don't know how much more I can take." The room remained still. No flicker of warmth, no sudden shift. Just the quiet fight between her faith and her exhaustion. And then, as if the enemy of her peace sensed her vulnerability, the whispers of the town began again. A neighbor, meaning no harm, mentioned during a brief doorstep conversation that people were wondering why trouble kept finding her. Another commented that maybe Emily needed to get back to church properly before things would settle. The words didn't accuse her directly, but they burrowed deep. By the 3rd night without heat, she felt something inside her bend dangerously, like a branch under too much snow. She feared it might snap. Yet even in that valley, half frozen, half doubting, something unseen was forming around her. A protection she could not feel, a purpose she could not guess. A piece of the miracle was moving into place, but for now, all she knew was the cold. On the 4th night without heat, the cold was sharper than any Emily had felt before, so sharp it seemed to cut through walls and blankets alike. She sat curled on the living room floor near the candles, her breath visible in faint clouds. The wooden lantern lay beside her, the carved star reflecting a trembling glow. She whispered a prayer, quiet, tired, almost voiceless. "Lord, I don't understand why you're letting this happen, but please don't let me break." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, followed by a single, heavy knock at the door. Emily startled. It was nearly midnight. She wrapped a blanket around herself and opened the door a cautious inch. Standing on the porch was an older woman she recognized dimly, Margaret Dawson, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down. She held a flashlight in one hand and a thermos in the other. Snowflakes clung to her grey hair. "Emily," Margaret said gently, "your lights have been flickering for hours. I worried something was wrong." Emily hesitated. "My furnace went out. I'm waiting for repairs." Margaret's eyes softened with concern. "And you've been here alone in this cold?" Without waiting for an explanation, she stepped closer. "Dear, you can't stay in this house another night." "I'm fine," Emily insisted weakly. Margaret shook her head. I lost my husband 6 winters ago. I know the look of someone trying to be strong while freezing inside and out. Please, come stay with me tonight. The firmness in her voice left no space for refusal. Emily nodded. When she stepped into Margaret's warm home minutes later, something inside her loosened. The heat, the soft lamplight, the scent of cinnamon tea. It all washed over her like a wave she hadn't realized she needed. As Emily warmed her hands around a mug, Margaret watched her quietly. You know, she said softly, I've been praying for months that God would show me how to use this big house to help someone again. It's been far too quiet since Harold passed. Emily looked up, surprised. You were praying for someone like me? Margaret smiled. Not like you. You, exactly you. I just didn't know your name yet. She leaned back in her chair. And when your lights flickered tonight, I felt prompted to check on you. I believe God sends us to each other at the right time. The words settled into Emily's heart, not as comfort alone, but as revelation. Every hardship of the past weeks, each loss, each silence, each cold night, had placed her in a moment where the right door could be knocked on, the right heart could be opened, the right connection formed. And then Margaret added, almost as an afterthought, I also volunteer at the church charity program. We're preparing a Christmas outreach for families hit hardest by the storm. I could use help organizing supplies tomorrow. You have a gentle way with people, Emily. Would you come? The question unfolded something buried deep inside her. Purpose. Not just healing, but purpose. Michael had spent years carving lanterns, small lights meant to brighten others. Now, in a way she couldn't have planned, Emily was being invited to carry a light of her own. She nodded slowly, tears warming her eyes. Yes, I'd like to help. In that quiet living room, surrounded by warmth she didn't expect, Emily realized that the path she thought was leading her deeper into loss had actually been guiding her toward her calling. Every step of pain had been tethered to a hidden purpose God was now unveiling. The cold had driven her to the exact person she needed, and the miracle was finally beginning to take shape. The next morning, Emily woke in Margaret's guest room, wrapped in a warmth she hadn't felt in days, not just physical warmth, but a quiet sense of safety. Light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, as though the day itself had been gentled for her. For the first time since Michael's passing, she rose without the familiar heaviness pressing on her chest. Margaret greeted her with breakfast and a smile that carried genuine affection. "Ready to meet me at the church?" she asked. Emily hesitated, then returned the smile. "Yes, I think I am." At the church hall, volunteers bustled around tables filled with canned goods, blankets, and handmade gifts. The air hummed with compassion and purpose. Emily watched for a moment, taking it all in, the simple goodness of ordinary people offering what they could. Margaret guided her toward a table of donated toys. "These are for the children whose parents lost work during the storm," she explained. "Would you help sort them?" Emily nodded and began arranging plush animals, small books, wooden trains. As she worked, an unexpected peace washed over her. Each small act, stacking boxes, tying ribbons, listening to volunteers share their stories, felt like stitching her own heart back together. Later, during a pause in the preparations, the pastor approached her. "Emily," he said softly, "Margaret tells me you've been a blessing today." "I'm just helping," she replied. He shook his head. "No, you're shining." The words caught her off guard. She looked down, blinking back tears she didn't expect. She hadn't felt like light in a long time. As the day unfolded, Emily found herself laughing softly at small moments, offering warmth to others, even comforting a young mother overwhelmed by uncertainty. She didn't force any of it. It rose naturally, like something long planted finally pushing through the soil. When evening arrived, she stepped outside the church and looked toward the horizon. Snowflakes drifted gently, illuminated by the street lamps, turning the world into a quiet silver tapestry. In that moment, she felt Michael close, not in sorrow, but in gratitude, as though he too could see the path unfolding. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the sky, but to the one who had walked with her through every valley. A presence settled around her, not loud or dramatic, but steady and real. The kind of presence she had prayed for on the coldest nights. Her furnace was repaired the next day. Her reduced hours at the clinic were restored the week after. But those blessings, while welcome, were no longer the center of her healing. Her heart had changed. Her purpose had awakened. And where grief once ruled, gratitude began to take its place. Emily was no longer surviving, she was being renewed. 3 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, Willow Creek gathered in the small stone church that stood at the center of town. Candles lined the windowsills, wreaths hung from wooden beams, and a soft choir hummed familiar hymns. Snow drifted outside like a quiet blessing, laying a fresh coat of white across the world. Emily arrived early, carrying a small box wrapped in simple brown paper. Margaret walked beside her, steady and warm, like the friend God had placed precisely when she needed one. The sanctuary glowed with a gentle golden light as families settled into their pews. At the front of the church stood a tall Christmas tree, decorated with handmade ornaments donated by the community. Beneath it lay gifts for the families who had lost the most during the storm, gifts Emily had helped sort, wrap, and arrange. Pastor Raymond greeted her with a knowing smile. "There's a place on the tree waiting for something special." Emily nodded and stepped closer. She opened the small box and lifted out Michael's unfinished wooden lantern. She had sanded it carefully, polished its edges, and carved the tiny star more clearly into its top. It was still simple, still imperfect, yet full of meaning. She hung it on a strong branch near the center of the tree. The candlelight around it flickered softly, making the small lantern glow as if lit from within. A warm hush moved through her chest. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "He would be proud of you, dear." Emily breathed in slowly. I think God was carving something in me too." As the service began, the choir's voices rose, filling the sanctuary with a peace that felt both ancient and new. Emily sat among friends, real ones now, no longer on the outskirts of her own life. She felt held, guided, and gently transformed. When the congregation lifted their candles toward the ceiling during the final hymn, Emily raised hers too. The flame danced, reflecting in her eyes. She didn't see only loss anymore. She saw purpose woven through every hardship, every frozen night, every unexpected kindness. From her place in the pew, she looked at the tree once more. The wooden lantern shone brighter than she expected, as though heaven itself had breathed on the flame behind the light. And in that soft glow, Emily understood the miracle had never been about avoiding the storm. It had been about discovering who she was becoming through it. In the quiet stillness of that Christmas Eve, as candles shimmered like tiny echoes of heaven, Emily felt the truth settle deep within her. God had never abandoned her, not in the silence, not in the cold, not in the nights when grief felt heavier than breath. Every loss had carried a thread of purpose. Every unanswered question had led her toward a greater light. And as she watched Michael's lantern glow on the tree, she understood what her journey had come to teach. God does not promise a life without storms, but he promises a purpose woven through every one of them. Pain had refined her, grace had carried her, and redemption had written the final word. Before you go, take a moment to breathe in the message behind Emily's journey. When life feels cold, when the path bends in ways you never expected, remember, God is still writing. Your story is not finished, and the miracle meant for you may be closer than you think. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the next reflection, like this video, to help it reach more people who need hope. And comment below telling us which city and country you're watching from. Your voice helps keep this circle of faith alive. May light find you wherever you are.